Shadows of the streets. The biting November wind howled through the alleyways of the city, tugging at the edges of a tattered, oversized jacket clinging to 13-year-old Ethan Hayes. He crouched low behind a rusted dumpster, his breath visible in the icy air. Nights like these were a stark reminder of how quickly life could turn from normalcy to chaos. Just a year ago, he was a typical 8th grader with a knack for math, a love for comic books, and a grandmother who always managed to make him smile. Now, the streets were his home, and survival was his daily mission. Ethan had learned the art of invisibility. It wasn't just about staying out of sight. It was about blending in, becoming part of the city's forgotten landscape. He scouted abandoned shops and quiet alleyways, avoiding the dangers that lurked in the shadows. He wasn't proud of the petty thefts, snatching a sandwich here or a pair of gloves there, but he did what he had to in order to keep going. That evening, the city was alive with the hum of bustling restaurants, honking cabs, and the faint echo of holiday tunes from street performers. Ethan slipped through the throng of people on the main street, his small frame weaving effortlessly between distracted shoppers. He lingered near an upscale cafe, the warm glow of its interior a stark contrast to the cold reality of the street outside. He huddled close to the cafe's outdoor seating area, hoping to catch the scent of freshly brewed coffee and maybe overhear a snippet of conversation to pass the time. His sharp eyes scanned the tables, watching the patrons sip lattes and laugh over plates of gourmet desserts. To Ethan, it was another world, one he barely remembered being a part of. Two figures caught his attention. A woman in an elegant coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled, sat across from a man who looked strikingly like her but older. Their whispered conversation was tense, their body language stiff. Something about their hushed tones piqued Ethan's curiosity, and he edged closer, keeping his movements subtle. "It has to look like an accident," the woman said, her voice low but distinct. Her words froze Ethan in place. The man, his sharp features a mirror of hers, nodded. "The brake lines. It's clean and quick. My contact will handle it tomorrow night." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he processed the exchange. Who were these people? What were they planning? His eyes darted back to the woman, and recognition struck him like a lightning bolt. He'd seen her face before, in a magazine he'd pulled from the trash. She was Rachel Marshall, the glamorous wife of billionaire tech mogul David Marshall. The man with her must have been her brother-in-law, Edward. Rachel leaned in closer, her manicured fingers tapping her coffee cup. "Once he's gone, the company will be mine. You'll get your share, and we can finally be free of him." Ethan's blood ran cold. They were planning to kill David Marshall. He crouched lower, his mind racing. Should he run? Call the police? The idea of walking into a police station made him shudder. Who would believe a street kid with no proof and no connections? He didn't even have a phone. But he couldn't ignore what he'd just heard. Someone's life was at stake. As the pair stood to leave, Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his small frame hidden in the shadows. They didn't glance in his direction as they walked away, their umbrellas shielding them from the drizzle that had started to fall. Ethan's mind churned with possibilities, each one seeming more impossible than the last. For hours, he paced the cold, wet streets, trying to devise a plan. He thought about David Marshall, the man who owned the towering building that loomed over the cafe. Ethan didn't know much about him beyond the headlines that praised his business acumen and philanthropic efforts. But one thing was clear: if Ethan didn't act, the man wouldn't live to see another day. By morning, Ethan had made his decision. He would go to the source. He would confront David Marshall himself. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the sleek glass tower that housed Marshall Technologies. He had done his best to clean up, washing his face in a public restroom and straightening his worn-out jacket. The towering skyscraper intimidated him, its reflective surface glinting in the pale sunlight. Security guards in crisp uniforms patrolled the entrance, their sharp eyes scanning the street. Ethan waited for what felt like hours, his resolve wavering with each passing minute. Just as he was about to give up, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the door, and David Marshall emerged, his tailored suit and commanding presence a stark contrast to Ethan's scrappy appearance. This was it. Ethan took a deep breath and darted forward, his voice rising above the din of the morning crowd. "Mr. Marshall, please, I need to talk to you." David barely glanced at him, his long strides carrying him toward the entrance. A security guard moved to intercept Ethan, his hand already reaching for the boy's arm. "It's about your wife," Ethan shouted, desperation lacing his voice. "She's planning to kill you." David stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face the boy. His piercing gaze locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "What did you just say?" David's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Ethan's stomach twist. Ethan took a shaky step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "Your wife and your brother. They're planning to tamper with your car brakes tonight. They want to make it look like an accident." The security guards hesitated, their eyes flicking to David for instruction. "Let him speak," David said, his tone unreadable. He gestured for Ethan to follow him inside. Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped into the luxurious lobby, its marble floors and high ceilings overwhelming him. He couldn't tell if this was bravery or insanity, but he was in too deep to back out now. In the elevator, the silence was suffocating. David towered over him, his sharp features betraying nothing. "You have 5 minutes to explain," he said as the doors closed. Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I overheard them at the cafe last night. Your wife and your brother. They were talking about tampering with your brakes so it would look like an accident. They're after your company." David's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy. "Why should I believe you?" Ethan met his gaze, his own voice firm. "Because I have nothing to gain from lying, and because no one deserves to die like that." David stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, he pressed a button, redirecting the elevator to his private office. "Tell me everything," he said. As the elevator ascended, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He had done the impossible. He had gotten through to David Marshall. But this was only the beginning. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed heavily on his shoulders, and he knew that if he didn't play his cards right, the truth might never come to light. And David Marshall's life depended on it. The plan unfolds. Ethan sat stiffly in the plush leather chair across from David Marshall's imposing mahogany desk. The office was a palace in the sky, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The sun was just beginning to burn through the morning fog, casting a golden glow over the towering skyscrapers below. But the beauty of the view was lost on Ethan, whose heart pounded with each passing second. David leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he listened intently to Ethan's account. The boy recounted every word, every glance, every subtle gesture he had observed the previous night. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, it grew steadier, bolstered by the seriousness with which David regarded him. "They mentioned the brakes specifically," Ethan said, his hands clenched in his lap. "They said it would happen tonight, while you're in your board meeting." David's piercing blue eyes remained fixed on Ethan, his expression unreadable. When the boy finished, silence fell over the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the city below. "You realize," David began slowly, "that what you're saying is not just a serious accusation. It's a dangerous one. If you're wrong." "I'm not wrong," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm despite his nerves. "I heard them. They weren't even trying to be subtle. They think no one would believe someone like me." David studied him for a long moment. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the man's intense gaze, but he didn't look away. Finally, David rose from his chair and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Ethan's eyes followed him, noting the tension in his shoulders. The man looked like a fortress, strong and immovable, but Ethan could sense the cracks. Something about the way he carried himself hinted at a deep weariness, a man who had spent years building an empire only to find it crumbling from within. "My wife," David said at last, his voice soft but tinged with bitterness. "We've been married for 12 years. I thought I knew her." He turned back to face Ethan, his expression hardening. "But you're not the first to suggest there's more to Rachel than meets the eye." Ethan blinked, surprised by the admission. "You've suspected her before." David nodded, returning to his desk. "Lately, yes. She's been distant, distracted. And my brother, Edward, he's always been ambitious. Too ambitious. I've brushed off their behavior, told myself I was imagining things. But if what you're saying is true—" "It is," Ethan said quickly. "And if you check your car, you'll see the proof." David pressed a button on his desk, summoning his head of security, a burly man named Carter who entered the office with a sharp salute. Ethan couldn't help but shrink back slightly at the sight of the towering figure. "Carter," David said, his tone brisk, "I need you to inspect my car. Thoroughly. Specifically, the brakes. Take your team and report back immediately." Carter nodded, his sharp eyes flicking briefly to Ethan before he left the room. David turned back to Ethan. "If they've tampered with my car, we'll have the evidence we need. But even so, proving their intent won't be easy. They'll deny everything. And people like Rachel and Edward don't leave trails." Ethan hesitated, then spoke. "What if you caught them in the act?" David raised an eyebrow. "How do you propose we do that?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They think their plan is foolproof. They're expecting you to drive home tonight. But what if we let them think everything is going according to plan? Let them move forward, but make sure you're not actually in danger." David's eyes narrowed as he considered the idea. "You're suggesting we set a trap?" Ethan nodded. "If they're involved personally, if they come to see it happen, you'll have the proof you need." David was silent for a moment, his mind clearly working through the logistics. Finally, he nodded. "You're more resourceful than I expected, Ethan. And you're right. If we're going to stop them, we need more than suspicion. We need undeniable evidence." Before they could discuss further, Carter returned, his expression grim. "Sir, we found what the boy described. The brake lines were tampered with. It was subtle, but the damage would have been catastrophic." David's jaw tightened, and a muscle in his temple twitched. He turned to Ethan, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You just saved my life." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. He had known he was doing the right thing, but hearing those words made it real. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want them to get away with it." David's sharp gaze softened, if only slightly. "And they won't." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of planning. David canceled all his meetings and called in a trusted private investigator to corroborate Ethan's story. The investigator, a wiry man named Archer, was quick to gather evidence. Within hours, he confirmed that large sums of money had been transferred from Rachel's private account to an offshore entity connected to a known criminal. "It's not enough to convict," Archer said, spreading out his findings on David's desk. "But it's a start. If we can catch them in the act, we'll have everything we need." David glanced at Ethan, who was sitting quietly in the corner, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that David's assistant had brought him. The boy had been remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, but David could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You've done more than enough, Ethan," David said, walking over to him. "You don't have to be involved any further." Ethan looked up, his expression resolute. "I want to help. You wouldn't even know about this if it weren't for me. Besides," he hesitated, then continued, "I've been invisible for so long. For once, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But if at any point you feel unsafe, you tell me." "Understood." Ethan nodded, and David clapped a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt strangely paternal. That evening, as the city lights began to flicker to life, the plan was set in motion. David would attend his board meeting as scheduled, maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. Meanwhile, Carter and his security team would be stationed throughout the parking garage, monitoring every move. Ethan, with his small frame and knack for staying unnoticed, would record the proceedings from a hidden vantage point. "They'll want to see it happen," Ethan said as they finalized the plan. "People like them. They don't trust anyone else to finish the job. They'll come to watch." David nodded. "And when they do, we'll be ready." As the clock ticked closer to the fateful hour, Ethan found himself in the parking garage, crouched behind a concrete pillar with a small camera in hand. The air was thick with tension, and every sound echoed ominously in the cavernous space. He glanced at the sleek black car that had been rigged with hidden sensors, its polished surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. In his earpiece, Carter's voice crackled to life. "Movement near the west entrance. Target acquired." Ethan's heart raced as he peeked around the pillar. Sure enough, Edward was there, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of his phone. A man in coveralls, the hired mechanic, approached the car, his toolbox in hand. Ethan steadied his camera, his hand shaking only slightly as he recorded the scene. The mechanic worked quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. Ethan could barely breathe as he watched, knowing that this was the moment they had been waiting for. "Targets are in position," Carter's voice came again. "Stand by for the signal." Ethan's grip tightened on the camera. He knew what came next, and he was ready. The trap was set. All they had to do was spring it. The sting in the shadows. The air in the underground parking garage felt thick with tension as the moments dragged on. Ethan's breathing was shallow, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. From his hidden vantage point behind a concrete pillar, he could see Edward standing near the west entrance, his phone illuminated in the dimly lit space. He appeared calm, composed even, but the tight grip on his phone betrayed the anticipation beneath his cool exterior. The hired mechanic, meanwhile, was crouched by David Marshall's car, working quickly and methodically under the hood. Ethan kept the camera steady, his small hands gripping it tightly. The lens captured every movement, the mechanic's practiced precision, Edward's watchful glances, and the occasional glance at the car's brake system. Every second felt like an eternity, but Ethan knew this footage was the linchpin of their plan. Carter's voice crackled softly in Ethan's earpiece. "We've got eyes on the mechanic. Edward is staying in position. All units, stand by." Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to calm the adrenaline surging through his veins. He focused on his task, knowing this was far bigger than him. He was the invisible witness, the one they'd never suspect. Across town, David sat at the head of the long conference table in Marshall Technologies' boardroom. The meeting was a ruse, a carefully orchestrated act to keep appearances. He glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking syncing with his own heartbeat. He had always been a man of composure, but tonight was different. The betrayal he had suspected for months was now stark reality, and the two people he had trusted most in the world had plotted his demise. David leaned back in his chair, pretending to listen as a department head droned on about projections. His mind, however, was elsewhere, focused on the parking garage where his life was being safeguarded by a team of experts and one incredibly brave street kid. "Mr. Marshall." The voice of one of the board members jolted him from his thoughts. "Yes," he replied smoothly, masking his distraction. The board member adjusted his glasses. "We were just discussing the budget allocations for next quarter. Do you have any input?" David offered a curt nod. "I trust the finance team has prepared a thorough analysis. Proceed as recommended." Satisfied, the board member continued, allowing David to sink back into his thoughts. He glanced at his phone, a secure text from Carter flashing briefly on the screen. "Targets in position. Mechanic tampering confirmed." The sting was in motion. In the garage, The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag and stood, giving Edward a quick nod. "It's done," he said gruffly. Edward's lips curled into a faint smile. He pocketed his phone and stepped closer to the car, inspecting it briefly before glancing toward the elevator. Perfect timing. "He'll be down soon," Edward muttered, more to himself than the mechanic. Ethan's camera caught every word, zooming in on Edward's face. His heart raced as he listened to Edward's smug tone. The man was savoring the moment, fully confident that his plan was flawless. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus, ensuring every detail was captured. Carter's voice came through the earpiece again, quiet but firm. "All units, prepare to move on my signal." Ethan's stomach tightened. The moment of truth was near. The elevator doors dinged softly, breaking the silence of the garage. Ethan's eyes darted to the far side, where David stepped out, his expression calm and collected. He walked toward his car with measured strides, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. To anyone watching, he was just a man ending a long day of work, oblivious to the danger that awaited him. But Ethan knew better. Edward tensed, stepping further into the shadows as David approached the car. The mechanic lingered near the service exit, ready to slip away unnoticed. Ethan's grip on the camera tightened as he captured every moment. David reached his car and paused, pretending to fumble with his keys. He glanced briefly toward the shadows where Edward stood, then slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, and the headlights illuminated the garage in a pale glow. "Now," Carter's voice commanded through the earpiece. Suddenly, the garage was flooded with light as multiple police cars screeched in from both entrances, their sirens blaring. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, their shouts echoing off the concrete walls. "Freeze!" Hands in the air. Edward's smug expression twisted into one of shock and panic. He turned to run, but two officers were already closing in on him. The mechanic dropped his rag and raised his hands, his face pale as the officers cuffed him. Ethan peeked from behind the pillar, his camera still rolling as Edward struggled against the officers, his voice rising in anger. "You can't do this. I didn't do anything." David stepped out of the car, his presence commanding as he approached his brother. Edward's face contorted with rage as he was forced to face the man he had betrayed. "How?" Edward spat, his voice dripping with venom. "How did you know?" David's gaze was cold, his voice steady. "You made the mistake of underestimating people, and your plan was never as flawless as you thought." Edward's eyes darted around, searching for answers. His gaze landed on Ethan, who had stepped cautiously into view, the camera still in his hands. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by a twisted sneer. "A street rat," Edward hissed. "You trusted a street rat over your own blood." David didn't flinch. Blood means nothing when it's tainted by greed. This boy risked everything to do the right thing. Something you clearly wouldn't understand. Edward lunged forward, but the officers held him firmly. "You'll regret this, David. You'll." "Enough." David interrupted, his voice cutting through Edward's rant. He turned to the lead detective. "Take them away." As Edward and the mechanic were led to the waiting police cars, Ethan lowered his camera, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder and looked up to see David standing beside him. "You did well," David said, his voice quieter now, but no less sincere. "Better than I could have expected." Ethan managed a small smile, though his legs felt like jelly. "I just wanted to help." David nodded, his gaze softening. "And you did. More than you'll ever know." Later that night, as the police processed the evidence and the garage returned to its usual stillness, David invited Ethan to a nearby diner. The boy hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting across from a man whose life was so far removed from his own. But hunger won out, and soon Ethan was wolfing down a burger while David sipped his coffee. "You said something earlier," David began, watching the boy carefully, "about being invisible. What did you mean by that?" Ethan hesitated, wiping ketchup from his chin. "It's just, people don't notice kids like me. We're just part of the background. I've been on my own since my grandmother died. I guess I got used to it." David's chest tightened at the boy's words. He saw the vulnerability beneath Ethan's tough exterior, the resilience that had kept him alive against all odds. "You don't have to be invisible anymore," David said firmly. "You've proven you're capable of incredible things, and I'd like to help you, if you'll let me." Ethan looked up, his eyes wide. "Help me how?" David leaned forward, his expression serious. "For starters, you're not going back to the streets. I'll make sure you have a place to stay, food to eat, and a chance to go back to school. You've got a sharp mind, Ethan. With the right opportunities, you could do anything." Ethan stared at him, the weight of David's words sinking in. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope ignited in his chest. "Why would you do that for me?" Ethan asked quietly. David smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Because sometimes, the people who save us aren't who we expect. And because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That it's not what we have, but what we do, that defines us." As they left the diner, Ethan couldn't help but glance up at the towering skyscrapers around them. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel so cold and unyielding. And for the first time, he didn't feel so invisible. The web of lies unravels. The next morning, the city buzzed with the shocking news. Tech billionaire thwarts murder plot. Wife and brother in custody. Headlines splashed across every major news outlet, accompanied by grainy photos of Rachel and Edward being led away in handcuffs. Media vans camped outside David Marshall's mansion, their reporters vying for sound bites and statements. The public was enthralled by the tale of betrayal, wealth, and survival. Yet, amid the chaos, David and Ethan remained remarkably composed, sheltering themselves from the frenzy in David's private lake house on the city's outskirts. Inside the serene, modern retreat, David sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open as he combed through emails and legal briefs. Across from him, Ethan carefully spooned cereal into his mouth, stealing occasional glances at the man who had just saved his life as much as he had saved David's. The silence was companionable, though Ethan's mind raced. He felt out of place in the sleek surroundings, his worn sneakers still damp from the night before, his second-hand jacket hanging on the back of his chair. Yet David had treated him with nothing but respect, as if he were an equal rather than a homeless kid who'd stumbled into his life. David finally broke the silence. "The police collected enough evidence last night to secure charges against Rachel and Edward. Between the financial records, the mechanic's confession, and your video, the case is airtight." Ethan nodded, setting his spoon down. "What happens to them now?" "They'll likely stand trial," David explained, his voice calm but edged with weariness. "With the evidence we have, it's almost certain they'll face prison time. My lawyers are working with the prosecutors to ensure they can't wiggle out of this." Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had been gnawing at him since the night before. "Do you think they ever cared about you?" David's expression darkened, his fingers curling slightly on the edge of the table. "I used to believe they did. Rachel and I were married for 12 years. I thought we were partners, building a life together. As for Edward," he paused, letting out a humorless laugh. "We grew up together. He was my brother. I always thought he had my back." "But he didn't," Ethan said quietly. "No," David agreed, his voice softening. "He didn't. It hurts to realize that the people you trusted the most are capable of such cruelty. But I also learned that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born into." Ethan looked down at his bowl, unsure how to respond. The concept of family felt foreign to him now, a relic of a life he'd lost long ago. His parents had died when he was too young to remember them clearly, leaving his grandmother to raise him. When she passed away, it felt like the last thread of connection had been severed. David seemed to sense his unease. "You're part of this story now, Ethan, whether you intended to be or not. And I want you to know that I don't take that lightly." Ethan frowned. What do you mean? David leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Ethan's. You've shown courage and integrity that most adults can't even muster. You've proven that you're capable of extraordinary things. I want to give you a chance to keep building on that. Ethan blinked, unsure of what to say. A chance to do what? To rebuild your life, David said simply. I want to be your guardian. Give you a home, an education, and the support you deserve. You don't have to live on the streets anymore, Ethan. Not if you don't want to. The words hit Ethan like a tidal wave. He stared at David, trying to process what he just heard. For so long, he'd been on his own, surviving by his wits and sheer determination. The idea of stability, of having someone who genuinely cared about him, felt almost too good to be true. You'd do that for me? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. You saved my life. I think it's only fair I return the favor. That afternoon, David drove Ethan to a local shopping center to buy him new clothes and essentials. At first, Ethan was hesitant, his instinct to refuse any help ingrained after months of fending for himself. But David's patience and encouragement slowly eased his nerves. Pick what you like, David said as they walked through the aisles of a department store. No one's judging you here. Ethan hesitated before reaching for a hoodie in a shade of dark green. This one's good, he muttered. David chuckled. You don't have to pick just one, Ethan. Let's get you a few things. An hour later, they left the store with several bags in tow. Ethan wore a new jacket and sneakers, his old tattered clothes stuffed into a plastic bag. He still felt out of place, but he couldn't deny how good it felt to have clothes that actually fit him. Thanks, he said awkwardly as they climbed into David's car. David glanced at him with a small smile. You don't have to thank me, Ethan. You've earned this. Meanwhile, back in the city, the investigation into Rachel and Edward's crimes deepened. The police uncovered years' worth of financial misdeeds, embezzlement, offshore accounts, and shady business deals. It became clear that Rachel and Edward had been planning their coup for far longer than anyone had suspected. Rachel, in particular, had maintained her facade with remarkable skill. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted her as the perfect wife, supportive and loving. But the cracks in her story began to show as investigators pieced together her secret dealings. She was always so charming, one neighbor told reporters. It's hard to believe she could be capable of something like this. David, however, wasn't surprised. As he sat in his lake house, reading through the latest updates from his lawyer, he couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. Rachel and Edward had underestimated him, and Ethan. They had believed themselves untouchable, their wealth and influence shielding them from consequences, but now their empire of lies was crumbling. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, David and Ethan sat on the deck, a quiet camaraderie settling between them. David nursed a glass of whiskey, while Ethan sipped on hot chocolate, the steam curling into the cool night air. You know, David began, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. I used to think success was about power, control, building something no one could take away from me. Ethan glanced at him. And now? David smiled faintly. Now I think it's about people. The ones who stand by you when everything else falls apart. You showed me that, Ethan. You reminded me what really matters. Ethan looked down at his mug, his thoughts swirling. He still wasn't sure what his future held, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had one. And that was enough. As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, two lives forever changed by a twist of fate. Neither of them knew exactly what lay ahead, but they both understood one thing. Together, they were stronger than the betrayals and hardships they had faced. The web of lies had unraveled, and from its threads, they were beginning to weave something new, something real. Rebuilding trust, restoring hope. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees surrounding the lake house. Ethan awoke in a real bed for the first time in months, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth and comfort that felt foreign yet welcome. The soft hum of life outside, the chirping of birds, the gentle rustling of leaves, was a stark contrast to the chaos of the city streets he called home. He stretched, reluctant to leave the safety of the blankets, but the tantalizing aroma of coffee and something sweet drew him downstairs. In the kitchen, David was flipping pancakes, a sight Ethan had never imagined. The billionaire tech mogul at a stove, wearing an apron that looked suspiciously homemade. David glanced over his shoulder, smiling. "Morning, Ethan. Hope you're hungry." Ethan nodded shyly, taking a seat at the counter. "I guess. Thanks." As David placed a plate of pancakes in front of him, topped with butter and syrup, Ethan hesitated. The simple act of someone cooking for him, a gesture of care, felt almost overwhelming. He picked up his fork, suddenly aware of how thin his arms looked against the polished counter. David joined him, sipping his coffee. "I figured we could take it easy today. You've been through a lot, and there's no rush to dive back into anything." Ethan chewed slowly, thinking, "What happens now? I mean, with everything." David set his mug down, his expression thoughtful. "Well, the case against Rachel and Edward is in motion. The police and my lawyers are handling it, so there's not much for us to do there. My focus is on making sure you're settled and figuring out what's next for both of us." Ethan looked up, startled. "Next for me? You're serious about letting me stay?" David nodded firmly. "Absolutely. I've already spoken with a friend of mine. He runs a program for kids who've been through tough times. He can help us get you back into school, and we'll make sure you have everything you need." Ethan frowned. "School? I don't know. I haven't been to school in over a year. I probably wouldn't fit in." David leaned forward, his voice gentle but resolute. "Ethan, you're incredibly smart. You picked up on things during this whole ordeal that most adults wouldn't. With the right support, you'll thrive. And you deserve a chance to do that." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. The streets had taught him to be self-reliant, to trust no one. But David's sincerity was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt the faint stirrings of hope. Later that day, David received a call from his private investigator, Archer. The man's voice was laced with urgency as he provided an update. "We've uncovered more," Archer said. "It's worse than we thought. Rachel and Edward weren't just targeting you for the company. They'd been siphoning funds for years. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, the works." David's jaw tightened. "How much are we talking?" "Millions," Archer replied grimly. "They've been bleeding your company dry. If you hadn't caught them when you did, the damage would have been catastrophic." David exhaled sharply, his free hand gripping the edge of his desk. The betrayal cut deeper with every revelation. Rachel and Edward hadn't just tried to kill him. They'd sought to destroy everything he'd built, everything he stood for. "What's our next move?" David asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We've got enough to ensure they won't see the outside of a prison for decades," Archer said. "But I'd recommend going public with some of this. Transparency will protect your company's reputation." David nodded. "Do it, but keep Ethan out of it. He doesn't need to be dragged into this any more than he already has." Archer agreed, and the call ended. David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, but his determination to rebuild was stronger. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to settle into life at the lake house. The transition wasn't easy. There were moments when he struggled to accept the stability, as if it might be ripped away at any moment. But David's unwavering patience and kindness slowly chipped away at his walls. David enrolled Ethan in the mentorship program he'd mentioned, pairing him with a counselor who specialized in helping kids from difficult backgrounds. The sessions were tough at first, forcing Ethan to confront emotions he'd buried for so long. But over time, he began to open up, sharing stories about his grandmother, the life he'd lost, and the resilience he'd built on the streets. "You've been through a lot," the counselor said during one session, "but you've also shown incredible strength. That's something no one can take away from you." Ethan carried those words with him, letting them anchor him as he navigated his new reality. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding Rachel and Edward reached its peak. The trial began, drawing national attention as the sordid details of their conspiracy came to light. The courtroom was packed with reporters, their cameras capturing every tearful outburst and damning revelation. Rachel's defense was predictable. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she'd been manipulated by Edward, but the evidence was overwhelming, and her act crumbled under cross-examination. Edward, true to form, turned on Rachel, blaming her for orchestrating the scheme. "They were parasites," David muttered one evening as he watched the news coverage with Ethan. "Feeding off everything I worked for." Ethan glanced at him, unsure what to say. He'd seen the pain in David's eyes, the way he masked it with composure. Despite everything, David was still human, still a man grappling with the betrayal of those closest to him. One evening, as they sat on the deck overlooking the lake, David turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he began. "What if we use this experience to help others?" Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" David gestured to the peaceful surroundings. "I've been given a second chance to rebuild my life. Thanks to you. And you've shown me the power of resilience. What if we created something together? A foundation to help kids like you, who've been dealt a tough hand." Ethan's eyes widened. "You'd do that?" David smiled. "Why not? You have first-hand experience with what it's like to live on the streets, to feel invisible. Your insight would be invaluable. Together, we could make a real difference." Ethan considered this, his mind racing. The idea of turning his pain into something meaningful felt both daunting and empowering. "What would we call it?" he asked finally. David thought for a moment, then said, "The Second Chance Initiative." Ethan nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I like it." In the months that followed, the foundation became a reality. David poured his resources into transforming an abandoned school building into a center for homeless youth, complete with classrooms, dormitories, and counseling services. Ethan played an active role, helping design programs and advocating for the kids who came through their doors. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up each morning and fight for something bigger than himself. And as he stood in the bustling halls of the center, surrounded by kids who were beginning to believe in themselves, he knew he had finally found a place where he belonged. David watched from a distance, pride swelling in his chest. The boy who had once been invisible was now a beacon of hope, shining brighter than anyone could have imagined. Their journey was far from over, but together they were rebuilding trust, restoring hope, and proving that even in the darkest of times, second chances could change everything. Legacy of Second Chances. 1 year after the night that changed both their lives, David and Ethan stood on the steps of the newly completed Second Chance Initiative Center, watching as a crowd gathered for the grand opening. The once abandoned school building had been transformed into a vibrant, state-of-the-art facility designed to house, educate, and support homeless youth. The walls, now painted in warm, welcoming colors, were adorned with murals created by local artists. Inside, classrooms were equipped with the latest technology, dormitories felt like home, and counseling rooms provided safe spaces for healing. The event had drawn local leaders, philanthropists, and even celebrities who wanted to be part of the movement. But the real stars of the day were the kids who had already begun to benefit from the initiative. Ethan glanced at David nervously as the media swarmed them, cameras flashing. "You're sure I should speak? They're here for you." David placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, this wouldn't exist without you. They need to hear your story, the real reason this place matters." Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. He had come a long way from the boy who huddled in the shadows of a cold city street. Now, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and jeans, he looked confident, even if he didn't quite feel it yet. As the ceremony began, David took to the podium first, addressing the crowd with the charisma and gravitas that had built his tech empire. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today is more than just the opening of a building. It's the beginning of a movement to recognize the potential in every child, no matter their circumstances, to give those who've been forgotten by society the tools they need to thrive." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "This initiative was born out of a personal experience, one that taught me the value of second chances. But the heart of this project isn't mine. It belongs to someone else, someone who showed me the power of courage, resilience, and doing what's right, even when it's hard." David turned to Ethan and gestured for him to step forward. The crowd applauded as Ethan approached the podium, his palms sweaty and his heart racing. He gripped the sides of the podium and took a deep breath, focusing on the faces of the kids in the crowd. Kids who, like him, had known what it was to feel invisible. "Hi," Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly. "My name is Ethan Hayes, and a year ago, I was just another kid living on the streets. I thought no one saw me, no one cared. But then something happened that changed my life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I overheard something. A plant hurt someone. I could have ignored it, stayed quiet. But something inside me told me I had to do something. And that decision led me here." Ethan's confidence grew as he continued. "This center isn't just a building. It's hope. It's a place where kids like me can feel safe, can dream, can finally be seen. And I'm not just standing here as someone who helped build it. I'm proof that second chances can change everything." The applause was deafening. Ethan stepped back, his face flushed but glowing with pride. David gave him a small nod, his expression filled with pride and approval. As the ceremony wound down, Ethan mingled with the guests, his shyness gradually giving way to excitement as he answered their questions and shared his vision for the initiative. Many were surprised by his maturity and insight, but David wasn't. He had seen Ethan's potential from the moment they met. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, David and Ethan sat on the center's rooftop. They had snuck away from the remaining crowd, seeking a quiet moment to reflect. "You were incredible today," David said, breaking the silence. Ethan shrugged, though his grin betrayed his pride. "I was terrified. My hands were shaking the whole time." "You didn't show it," David replied. "And even if you did, that's what makes you real. People connect with that." Ethan leaned back, gazing up at the stars. "Do you think this place will really make a difference?" David followed his gaze. "I know it will. Because it's not just a building. It's a beacon. And you're the light that started it." As the months passed, the Second Chance Initiative flourished. Ethan took an active role in the organization, balancing his schoolwork with helping manage day-to-day operations at the center. His natural leadership and ability to connect with the kids made him invaluable. He was more than just a success story. He was an inspiration. David, meanwhile, found a renewed sense of purpose in mentoring Ethan and overseeing the initiative. He stepped back from the tech world, delegating much of his company's responsibilities to trusted executives. His focus had shifted. Success was no longer measured in profits, but in the lives he could change. One evening, Ethan and David sat in the center's quiet office, reviewing plans for a second location in Chicago. The foundation's success had drawn national attention, and donations were pouring in. "This is happening so fast," Ethan said, flipping through the blueprints. "I can't believe we're opening another center already." David smiled. "That's because people believe in what we're doing, and they believe in you." Ethan glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "I still don't get why you trusted me. Back then, I was just a kid off the street." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You were more than that, Ethan. You had integrity, courage, and a heart that refused to let someone else suffer, even when you didn't have much yourself. That's rare. And I saw it the moment you stepped into my office." Ethan looked down, his voice soft. "I don't know if I would have made it without you." David reached across the table, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We saved each other, Ethan. Don't ever forget that." As the years passed, the Second Chance Initiative became a national movement, with centers in major cities across the country. Ethan grew into a confident young man, his name synonymous with hope and resilience. He spoke at conferences, met with world leaders, and even testified before Congress, advocating for better support systems for homeless youth. Through it all, he and David remained close, their bond stronger than ever. They weren't just a mentor and protege or a guardian and ward, they were family. One day, as they walked through the original center, now bustling with activity, Ethan paused by a wall of photos showcasing success stories, smiling faces of kids who had found a new path thanks to the initiative. David joined him, his voice quiet. "Look at what you've built." Ethan shook his head, smiling. "We built it, together." David chuckled. "I suppose we did." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had accomplished settling over them. Then Ethan turned to David, his expression resolute. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's so much more we can do." David nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Then let's get to it." And together, they walked forward, ready to continue their work, not just changing lives, but creating a legacy of second chances for generations to come.